I'm Alice McGrath. I'm a postdoctoral fellow for accessibility here at Penn Libraries, and I'm very excited to be chairing this panel. I have, first up, we have Barrett Kalter, who's an associate professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His book, Modern Antiques, The Material Past in England, 1660 to 1780, appeared from Bucknell in 2012. The book examines the influence of antiquarianism on the literary and material culture of the long 18th century, with chapters on Dryden, Gray, and Walpole. His current project, The Literature of Hunger in the Age of Taste, examines 18th century writing about food, nutrition, and appetite, chiefly outside the domains of aesthetic and consumer culture. And Dr. Kalter will be presenting a paper called Swift and the Art of Disgust.
Thank you. So yes, for better or worse, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so disgusting images to it. Jonathan Swift is our laureate of disgust. Think, for example, of cannibalism in A Modest Proposal, the flood of market trash in the final triplet of A Description of a City Shower, the grotesque bodies in Gulliver's Travels, and Celia's full chamber pot in The Lady's Dressing Room, one of a suite of misogynist verse analyzed in a chapter entitled simply The Disgusting Poems in Damrosch's 2013 biography. Norman O. Brown diagnosed Swift's excremental vision as at once a symptom and a satirical indictment of the neurotic discontent civilization produces, while Claude Rawson has placed Swift's misanthropy in an intellectual tradition of conservative anti-humanism. Recent work on disgust by philosophers and critical theorists provides an opportunity to re-examine the strange, suasive force of Swiftian disgust, which attracts by repulsion, enlisting readers in a moral regimen not through a rational process of appeal, but by turning our stomachs. This recent work approaches disgust in two distinct contexts, ethics and aesthetics. Wendy Brown and Martha Nussbaum challenge a foundationalist claim that disgust is an innate and therefore trustworthy basis for moral and legal judgment, arguing instead that disgust shows how deeply ideology penetrates and controls the body. In their view, disgust is a merely affective manifestation of prejudice and therefore should be bracketed off in judgment and ideally expunged from the body, a position that suggests an untenable disgust at disgust. By contrast, Carolyn Korsmeyer writes about the pleasure derived from art that nauseates and empties out the contents of the self, thus recasting the disgusting as a form of the sublime. These contrary reactions to disgust, resistant and appreciative, heave and churn in Swift's satire. This presentation will situate Swift's work at the nexus of the aesthetic and ethical axes just described, addressing how his satire revels in the refuse of polite taste and converts Swift's savage indignation at moral or political opponents into the more contagious register of revulsion. The central function of disgust is to mark and maintain boundaries. The apparently universal disgust reflex, which includes physical withdrawal, the partial closing of the eyes and nostrils, the curling of the lips, an extension of the tongue, this is what they call the disgust face, and often nausea, may have evolved to prevent pathogens from entering the body, especially through the mouth. The reflex protects our insides from contamination by closing access to them. Conversely, in a psychological model best represented by Kristeva's work on the abject, disgust is a mechanism of denial and displacement, expelling inherent aspects of identity that are deemed unclean. Working together, disgust's functions of defense and expulsion work to outline and preserve an inner purity against an external world perceived as hostile. What has already passed out of the body and what threatens to enter the body are what provoke disgust. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt identifies 7 disgust elicitors, which in fact read like an index to Swift's work. Food, animals, body products, sex, death, body envelope violations, hygiene violations. Finally, Haidt's capacious 8th category includes any neutral object that is viewed as polluted or comes to be viewed as polluted after coming into contact with one of these elicitors. For example, a used handkerchief, even if it is laundered. We recoil from these objects, which remind us of human frailty, mortality, of our biological needs and drives. But since these are inevitable features of life, disgust is an especially volatile and harried emotion, keeping vigil against an alterity that can never be successfully suppressed or canceled, and that haunts the margins of identity. Somewhat ironically, given this intolerance of the foreign, disgust itself may be an acquired emotion. In Freud's account, it is a historical precipitate of social prohibitions, chiefly surrounding sex, that over time have been incorporated into the human mind, awaiting activation during the course of each child's development, in Freud's word, when upbringing and external influence give the signal. Socialization explains the extension of physical disgust to moral disgust, wherein bodily sensation is commandeered to inculcate and reinforce norms. Norbert Elias's study of early modern conduct literature examines how malleable and responsive to social conditioning the disgust reflex is, and also how indispensable a tool for the formation and control of boundaries around the self and the self-same. Modernity's gradual lowering of the disgust threshold is not a progressive march toward sensible decorum and laudable hygiene for Elias, but an ever deeper embedding of the subject within a web of restrictive norms and discriminating judgments that work to consolidate and legitimate first the feudal court, then the absolutist state, and finally the empire through the exclusion and subordination of a population deemed unclean. Civility prizes aesthetic discernment, and no feeling is more intimately connected to the acts of definition, evaluation, and ranking that constitute aesthetic judgment than disgust. Attachment, preference is measured out in varying degrees of intensity, only to what remains after a triage of all that can't be allowed in or near the body. As Bourdieu observes, tastes are perhaps first and foremost distastes. Judgment also mandates a disavowal of the body's displeasures as well as pleasures, which are in a sense driven from the body as impure and contaminating influences. Disgust thus has a dual function in the process of aesthetic judgment, rejecting what is deemed in bad taste, but also rejecting itself to secure the disinterestedness that the faculty of taste requires to believe its judgments are correct. The 18th century is the period when concern for taste and manners moves beyond the precincts of the court and becomes central to the self-understanding of the English middle class. The man, typically a man or woman of taste, embodies a principle of self-governance by which a system of informal rules are internalized, naturalized, and referred outward in critical apprehension of the world. Swift then seizes the role of arbiter of disgust at a pivotal moment in the civilizing process as taste grows central to the efforts of a new social class to gain hegemony. The nodes in the commercial network that gave this class its economic independence from the aristocracy, while also allowing it to appropriate the signs of aristocratic distinction, appear again and again in Swift's work as contemptuous and repulsive. The unsanitary marketplace, riddled with cheap commodities, barely distinguishable from the garbage they become. The city, overcrowded with a menacing heterogeneous population, and the colony, at once the impoverished result of shameful English appetites and a disturbing zone of ethnic and religious difference from which the English are right to keep distant. In these sites, in Swift's view, he reveals the sordid underpinnings of politeness, which remains mired in the very materiality, corporeality, and hunger that aesthetic taste strives to transcend. A modest proposal lampoons the man of taste in the figure of the proposer, who takes pains to signal his sensitivity to suffering, his humility, his disinterestedness, and also his refined palate. His plan to commercialize cannibalism presupposes a community of elegant consumers, connoisseurs eager to sample new delicacies, and fashion-conscious, emulous spenders. In this way, Swift spreads blame from a relatively small group of absentee landlords to include the polite English and Anglo-Irish citizens whose standard of living is improved by the colonial regime. However, the proposer's inability to anticipate, let alone feel, the disgust his proposal will elicit makes apparent the way taste follows from distaste. For only someone fundamentally disgusted by the Irish poor could conceive of such a barbaric solution to their poverty. The genial, concerned tone of the essay's preamble leads the reader to swallow, in the act of contemplation, some of the proposer's more understated but still inhumane views. In fact, the reader may be relieved to see his own sense of begging as a form of urban blight condemned by the proposer in a voice that is generous rather than petty, and in an idiom drawn from political economy that is seemingly objective rather than blatantly phobic. The revulsion the reader first feels at the abrupt reference to eating infants in the 9th paragraph of the essay scrambles to retract assent from an attitude he had until then been willing to entertain or tacitly acknowledge as his own. By leading the reader to partly consume the proposal before listing its unpalatable ingredients, Swift implicates the reader in a disgust that he comes to feel for, but that cannot sever him from the proposer, who merely articulates the prejudices that are formative of, yet unacceptable to, a modern sense of taste. Swift's contributions to the discourse of aesthetic judgment thus implies disgust in contradictory ways. On the one hand, he claims authority to define the disgusting and to represent as physically grotesque what incites his moral disapproval. Disgust becomes the standard for barring the Irish, women, the poor, Catholics from entry into civil society. And conversely, in his portrayal of the disgusting, the bourgeois English subject finds epitomized what he must define himself against. On the other hand, Swift exposed the civilized as caught in degradation the more it tries to extricate itself from it. The cultural practices of refinement, of eating well and keeping up appearances lead to collusion in the immiseration of others. Disgust returns to condemn the disgusted, just as Gulliver eventually recognizes himself in the face of the Yahoo. Disgust is an ideal register for satire, ensuring the detachment necessary for impartial judgment and provoking the withdrawal of negative judgment. When we experience our strong disapproval as disgust, our feeling is identical to the feeling we have when we taste or see an offensive object. The gorge rises with our censure. The physiology of distaste colludes with and even abets our condemnation, and in this way, norms draw energy from, and animate our bodies. The noisome, the pestilent, the soiled and spoiled are the ordinary channels of Swift's criticism. He routinely uses the physically repellent to represent and condemn a range of social infractions, from the taboo to the trivial: rack-renting, voyeurism, gluttony, prostitution, poor hygiene, an overuse of cant or even monosyllables, and so on. Throughout runs an animosity for the abnormal body, dirty or disguised by cosmetics, bizarrely magnified or shrunk, aged beyond decrepitude and rendered bestial. The body that crudely but therefore effectively transmits normative limits, which are at once material and ethical. By portraying the actions and beliefs that upset him in relation to or simply as the things that reliably elicit disgust in most people, Swift hails the reader to his side of the dispute without having to argue the case. An involuntary giggle or retching forecloses careful reflection when, say, heterodox expressions of faith are dismissed as belches and farts. To be able to understand what is at stake in this opinion of enthusiasm, and even decide if one agrees with it, requires closer consideration of a religious controversy, but closeness is precisely what the distancing impulse of disgust prevents. Swift is, of course, not the only satirist who elicits disgust to compel the reader to see things his way. But in his writings, disgust is so amplified it becomes a basic orientation to the world, before taking a distinctive, unsettling inward turn. For as soon as we are convinced that something outside of us is offensive and must be kept there, we are shown that the thing already exists at our core. In many instances, the disgust Swift raises has outlived the specific targets of his satire, and his dislike of the marginalized now seems more troubling than the vices he attributes to them. The endurance of the disgusting in his writings, the images that continued to disturb even after the original aims of that disturbance ceased to matter, show Swift's success in identifying those bodily norms that are most robust to historical change, if not exactly transhistorical. But even in his moment when the topicality of the satire was most fresh, the disgust he raises tends to exceed what the situation requires, and finally seems to become his purpose rather than an adjunct to it. We do not really need 24 paragraphs minutely detailing the analogy of colonialism and cannibalism to grasp the essential and blunt critique, but the elaboration of the plan in wretched nuance does offer a surplus enjoyment that serves no clear satiric purpose. Swift may wield disgust as an instrument of satire, but if we subtract the satirical component from his work, does what remain have an aesthetic quality of its own? Is there an art of disgust? As mentioned earlier, disgust has a dual role in the paradigm of aesthetics that emerges in the 18th century. Disgust is the emotion that expels objects of bad taste from consideration, but that then must expel itself as the kind of visceral response that contradicts the dispassion upheld as a standard of taste. However, if we recall that aesthetics was first defined in the work of Alexander Baumgarten as a science of perception rather than a discipline of evaluation, we can find an alternative account of the place of the disgusting in Swift's writings. No writer tells us more about disgust as a mode of perception than Swift. What disgusts us, to what degree and under what conditions, how the different senses experience it, and finally, in Gulliver's alienated retreat from the yahoos he recognizes in himself and his family, how an identity managed through disgust of the other will finally be divided destructively against itself. Swift's effort to catalog a grimy plenitude partakes in the ambivalence of disgust, a defensive state in which, according to the phenomenologist Orwell Kolnai, we waver between the avoidance of fear and the approach of anger. Kolnai observes that, quote, once provoked, disgust searches out the object in all its essentiality. Where fear aims to become free of the object and hate tries to annihilate it, disgust holds something of a middle position. The disgusting is an outrage that cries out for a fuller discovery. As Kolnai puts it, disgust, quote, leads us much more to a cleaning up of our surroundings, a weeding out of what is disgusting in them. This cleaning up takes the form of the language that always swarms around and takes nourishment from the squalid in Swift's writings. The page-long lists of crimes and rosters of the guilty, the cascades of invective, the panoramic descriptions of vice from every angle and in every stage of decline. Disgust is not succinct or soft-spoken. It spills forth in an excrescence of words that are stained by the very mess they strive to contain. Disgust generates an abundance of text by building on its own momentum, that is, its creativity. What better representative of disgust's propensity to draw us toward the disgusting in an attempt to establish our difference from it is there than Strephon, who roots through Celia's messy belongings, transfixed by what he finds. There is a perverse delectation in the inventory of a lady's dressing room, a poem that draws out of misogynistic satire an affirmation of what counts as a properly aesthetic disposition. Strephon's desire for Celia rests precariously on his denial of her body. His appreciation, which requires a naive and phobic rejection of corporeality in favor of a pristine ideal, cannot recover from exposure to the real, and finally gives way to an all-consuming disgust. The speaker concludes the poem by offering his own judicious response as normative, urging the reader to transcend Strephon's juvenile disgust and instead marvel at the tulip sprung from dung. From the speaker's vantage, the disgusting cannot pollute the beautiful. In fact, he insists, we need the disgusting to form a correct judgment of the beautiful in the first place. However, the speaker's exordium seems disingenuous in light of the poem's thorough exploitation of the lurid and unclean to hold our attention. Just like Strephon, we are drawn to the disgusting in the account, driven by disgust's propensity, in Kolnai's words, to search out its object in its whole essentiality. Strephon needs to keep the beautiful separate from the disgusting for fear of contamination. The narrator needs the disgusting as both the foil that sets the beautiful into relief and also the obstacle he must work to overcome to achieve a higher form of enjoyment. The men share a conviction that the aesthetic amounts to the beautiful and only disagree on whether the beautiful is better served through an absolute avoidance or a willed suspension of disgust. But the poem's manner of dwelling on the disgusting suggests a counter-aesthetics that does more with disgust than make it serve the beautiful. Rather, Swift finds in the violation of good taste a magical resource for the conjuration of aesthetic aura. The disgusting is an inversion of Swiftian style in proper words and in proper places that captivate by flaunting decorum. Celia's decorated close stool may thus be viewed not only as a descendant of the scatology of Juvenalian and libertine satire, but also as an ancestor of a modern scatological avant-garde that stretches from Duchamp's fountain urinal, Piero Manzoni's canned artist's shit, Andres Serrano's photographs of a crucifix plunged in urine, and most recently, Maurizio Catalan's America, an 18-karat gold toilet installed at the Guggenheim in a public restroom for visitors to use, in which the museum recently offered to Donald Trump for installation in the White House, in lieu of the painting by Van Gogh the president requested. As in the ladies' dressing room, these works provoke by bringing the impure within the consecrated realm of the aesthetic, the museum space, whose fetish quality is not destroyed by, but rather recoded in terms of an act of scandalous defilement. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Sharif Youssef. He's a JD candidate in his final semester at the University of Toronto, Faculty of Law, and holds a doctorate of English literature from the University of Chicago. In 2016 to 2017, Dr. Youssef held the position of lecturer of English at Clemson University. Before that, he was visiting assistant professor of law, jurisprudence, and social thought at Amherst College. His writings have appeared in Law and Literature, Criticism, and Humanity. He co-edited a special issue of Modern Language Quarterly on the subject of inevitable, inescapable consequences, and he also recently completed editing an interdisciplinary anthology called The Hostile Takeover: Human Rights After Corporate Personhood. His book project, The Actuarial Form, examines moral hazard and mass casualty statistics in 18th century novels and memoirs. An essay drawn from his next book project entitled Refugees and the Rise of the Novel is currently under review. And Dr. Youssef will be presenting on a fiscal theory of satire. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about money, and there was nothing more disgusting to Swift than money, so I think it's fitting that our two go together, but I'm getting old, so I'm going to put on my reading glasses. Is this good enough? Okay, Gilbert versus Brett, which came to be known as the case of the mixed money, remains even today the leading English case on monetary policy. The case played a key role in the 7 pamphlets that constitute the Drapier's Letters, which Jonathan Swift published between 1724 and 25 under the pseudonym of Lord Drapier. The case imports into English legal reasoning and makes absolute what's known as the nominalist principle of money. This is not working for me, okay. In which state institutions or the sovereign legally fix the value of money regardless of its purchasing power. It adopts nominalism in the common law from canon and civil sources and rejects what's known as the medalist doctrine of money, whereby the value of a monetary unit is determined through a metallic standard and through the quantity or weight of the currency. The case concluded that it is the sovereign, specifically Elizabeth I, who has the prerogative to unilaterally raise or debase the value of coin regardless of its metal content. Common law is an oral tradition, a practical indoctrination, and in common law, cases come to stand for or be about principles that don't always withstand scrutiny when you read the original case. Occasionally, when the legal principle that is articulated in the case comes to be detached from the facts and the adjacent legal issues, the principle will be expressed in absolute terms, unless in later judgments, decision makers go back, examine the original decision, and progressively limit the principle it deploys. However, lawyers, like literary critics, are limited in interpretation by their sources and the changing nature of legal record keeping. To avoid embarrassment, I always go back to the original case, not to the published English reporter. But that's not possible with the case of the mixed money. And in fact, if you go to the reporter, you'll think you found the case, but you'll in fact be seeing Jonathan Davies' summary of it written after the decision was rendered. Davies was Solicitor General of Ireland, who likely argued the case before the Privy Council. The Privy Council's own records were lost in a fire that destroyed legal reports from 1602 to 1605. Davies' account, written in law French, cites civil law sources written after the decision was rendered, which has led David Fox, a comparative legal historian at the University of Edinburgh School of Law, to warn that the case, as received, is highly embellished by Davies. We can take it as an after-the-fact explanation of the likely reasoning of the court, though biased in favor of one of the arguing parties. Because there were no later cases to narrow the nominalist principle used in the case of the mixed money, and because we don't have the original decision, Davies' slant gives an unconditioned principle that came to be used in Anglo-Irish monetary policy. By the 18th century, Jonathan Swift concluded that treating the principle of the case as given could have disastrous results in Ireland. Gilbert, the plaintiff, was a grocer who sold wares to Irish merchants who supplied English troops. Occupation is in the background of all of this. He was a speculator who won value through exchange rates and was one of the many tradesmen who were a thorn in the side of the Crown's efforts to maintain a uniform monetary policy. Fox summarizes the dispute as follows, so I'll just read you the beginning of his brief of the case. In April 1601, Brett bought certain wares from Gilbert in London. Brett's debt from the sale was expressed in the common form of penal bond. He would become liable to pay the larger sum of £200 unless by the due date he paid sterling, current, and lawful money of England. The agreement stipulated both for sterling and for lawful money of England. Typically, they would just say lawful money of England. Brett agreed to the terms of the exchange, so I'm no longer quoting. But the date of performance or payment was set to occur after the 20th of May, 1601, on which day a proclamation devaluing Irish coins was issued. Brett paid the amount stipulated in the devalued currency. The legal questions, were Irish coins money of England? The Privy Council said, sure. They were minted in the Tower of London even though they were issued in Ireland. Could Gilbert insist on payment in coin of a higher standard? The council said, no way. One can pay in official coin at the time due, even after demonetization. This only makes economic sense. We're concerned with ex-ante predictability, more concerned with ex-ante predictability than preventing merchants from voluntarily taking reasonable risks. A century later, in the Drapier's letters, Swift contests the ironmonger William Wood's privately purchased patent to mint and issue copper coins. He bought it from the Duchess of Kendal. In the course of the contest around the coins, the English Privy Council approved the patent, and it had the King's approval as well. Swift probably correctly accused Wood of bribery, and he writes a poem fantasizing about Wood's execution, fantasizing about being in the, watching the execution. In letter 3 of the Drapier's letters, Swift turns to Davies' account of the reasoning behind the case several times. Lord Drapier assures his readers that he has retained legal counsel and that they have referred him to Andrew Horne's 14th century The Mirror of Justices, which Drapier claims emanates legal authority since it's off-cited by that great lawyer, my Lord Coke. It's a bad source for the case of the mixed money, though, because Cook's written, well after the case of the mixed money. Horne had argued that debased currency can only be required to be taken as legal tender by an act of Parliament. And in the case of the mixed money, there is an extensive discussion of Elizabeth I's power to devalue coin without an act of Parliament. Davies claims that public necessity granted Elizabeth that power in that specific case. And Lord Drapier concedes that the Tyrone Rebellion provided sufficient justification to Elizabeth, but circumstances have changed. He writes, "Whatever is done in great exigencies and dangerous times should never be an example to proceed by in seasons of peace and quietness." So his character, Lord Drapier, points out that there are no exigent circumstances sufficient to justify a state of exception here. Davies never explains the rationale underlying Swift's point, or the rationale that Swift is making use of. If it's the sovereign's prerogative to strike coin, why would an emergency be required to justify her decision to do so unilaterally? As Fox observes, in canon law, debasement of the coinage was a kind of theft from the populace. It was a sin of the sovereign for which his soul would be answerable. The rationalization was that debasement could be permitted if the public gave its assent. Usually some authorization from Parliament was sufficient for that purpose. Drapier is careful, or Swift is careful through Drapier, not to court treason by accusing the sovereign of acting illegally. Instead, the explanation of why sovereigns traditionally place limitations on their own authority makes the authority to legislate the value of the coinage a key legal issue, a rule of law issue. The patent bought by Wood was approved by the Privy Council, quote, "but this proceeding is rejected by all the best lawyers as contrary to law. The Privy Council here having no such legal power," end quote. Furthermore, while it's traditionally taken to be the exclusive province of the sovereign to strike coin, Swift cites Cook as an authority to show that this power in England only extends to silver and gold, not to base metals such as copper. I've discussed this with legal historians, and they get very angry. This is a very bad legal argument. It doesn't matter if it's a bad legal argument. Yes, copper, the king has the same power over copper as he does over gold and silver. This is a technicality Swift is finding, but it's an argument that he used. For these reasons, he advises his friends in Ireland to refuse this filthy trash. So money is disgusting. The dependency of Ireland on Great Britain Act of 1719 makes the English House of Lords the final court of appeal for Irish law. Yet Swift isn't interested in appealing this decision to a higher authority. Rather, he attacks the legitimacy of the decision in order to provoke a constitutional crisis. The abuse of royal prerogative was a matter of great concern after the institutional limitations imposed upon that power during the Glorious Revolution. John Traugott observes that Swift is issuing a revolutionary challenge in England in this invocation of precedent, arguing that Swift implies that the English have, quote, turned their back on the government in its perversion of the constitutional limitation on the monarchy, end quote. In addition to claiming that the unilateral award of the patent had usurped power from Ireland's parliament, Swift strategically insinuated that the Crown had, more importantly, taken action that were ultra vires its powers within English law. The idea that coinage needed parliamentary consent really only took hold in England after the 1688 Glorious Revolution. It's significant that the entire 1696 silver recoinage was authorized by an act of Parliament rather than simply implemented by prerogative proclamation. If English law were to have a constitutional character, it would require consistency that would make decisions reliably predictable, ex ante predictability, and that principle looks backwards, it's precedent. But in Swift's eyes, English legislators had overplayed their hand. In Gulliver's Travels, officers of the court openly degrade precedent. I'll read you a quote here. Gulliver is explaining England to the Wynnhams, to his Wynnham master. It's a maxim among these lawyers that whatever has been done before may legally be done again. And therefore, they take special care to record all the decisions formally made against common justice and the general reason of mankind. These, under the name of precedents, they produce as authorities to justify the most iniquitous opinions, and the judges never fail to direct accordingly. So here, common justice would refer to common law, and in the case of monetary policy, the duty to consult Ireland's parliament. As applied to monetary policy, precedent ought to have constrained the Privy Council. By pretending to respect precedent while issuing capricious absolutist decisions, The law is emptied of authority, and in response to this unwinding of the social contract, Drapier is allowed to cede popular rage. It's baseless absolutism that constitutes the subject of the Travels. That is to say, it's not that Swift is attacking law. He's attacking caprice that through a masquerade undermines the law. The Travels satirize legal inconsistencies throughout, while Gulliver himself operates as a stand-in for Swift's conviction that we are implicated in and victimized by absolutist legal systems. Gulliver believes that every single legal system he encounters has a universal basis in morality, which makes no sense because he's encountering completely different positive law systems. One of Gulliver's maddening tendencies is to take legislators at their words, much like complacent Irish shopkeepers who will take English money at face value. Swift worries that we normalize outrageous abuses of the law. Authorities themselves have no respect for legal tradition, and therefore they lack authority. The king of Lilliput stuffs his pillows with judges. Gulliver blithely describes a monstrous figure that stands for justice in the Lilliputian legal system. Apparently, in Sherman County, Tennessee, in the courthouse, there's a version of this, which makes no sense to me. I can't imagine them understanding the irony. It is, quote, "It is upon this account that the image of justice in their courts of judicature is formed with 6 eyes, 2 before, as many behind, and 1 on each side, to signify circumspection. With a bag of gold open in her right hand and a sword sheathed in her left to show she is more disposed to reward than to punish." Lilliputian justice turns around the conventional image of justice as blind. Justice in Lilliput looks in every direction for a bribe, and it watches its back. Gulliver describes Lilliput's legal system as reward-based justice rather than punitive justice, and what he describes is a system of legitimate graft and corruption. Traditionally, the image used is of justice as a bearer of scales, yet in Lilliput, the money bag casts a different set of meanings on the scales in the more conventional image, one that points simultaneously to bribery, to greed, and inequality. The weight of coins is balanced by the sword in the other hand, which will enforce the value attributed to the bag of money. Justice's authority is bought by gold and maintained by iron. Wood and his partisans attempted to counter objections that the coins were substantially debased. Isaac Newton was called to testify to the substance of the coins and to certify their validity before the House of Lords. But this dodged the issue of authority. Drapier describes Newton's testimony as farcical, arguing that the copper content is ultimately beside the point. More important is the legal infrastructure of voluntary agreements that supports money. Drapier discusses Newton's examination of the coin and his report that, quote, "Wood had in all respects performed his contract." His contract? With whom? Was it with the Parliament or the people of Ireland? Are they not to be the purchasers? But they detest, abhor, and reject it as corrupt, fraudulent, mingled with dirt and trash. Upon which he grows angry, meaning Wood, goes to law and will impose his goods upon us by force. Newton is figured as a technocrat stooge who weighs coin to confirm what's already known. They are as valuable as Wood's imprint on the face of the coin announces them to be. And in doing so, in playing the complicated simpleton, the Gulliver, Newton abets a fraud by confirming that the terms in an involuntary contract are valid. Drapier insinuates that Newton could also be a co-conspirator, and even if not, his procedures are subject to fraud. Wood could easily just mint a dozen pure coins and send them on to Newton. Wood's efforts were not seen as some mere financial fraud. His allies had bypassed constitutional law and were threatening imperial violence. Wood was despicable, but he's not really the target here. Drapier warns that Walpole's intention is to overcome Irish resistance to the coin by paying soldiers stationed in Ireland with the debased coins. Quote, "And this is the difficulty you will be under. For the common soldier, when he goes to the market or alehouse, will offer this money, and if it be refused, perhaps he will swagger and hector, and threaten to beat the butcher or alewife, or take the goods by force and throw them the bad halfpence. The choice these coins present is between financial rapacity and military rapacity, and ultimately there is no choice between them. They're the same thing. The Irish have been entered into an armed conflict the moment their money loses the veneer of civil authority." The Drapier's letters and Gulliver's Travels are works that share an interest in exchange, misunderstanding, and incommensurability. And the satire in common is comedy that's based on legally legitimated transactional violence. Swift relies on an earlier connection between the nature of legal money and comedy. John Locke established commensurability as both the proper subject matter of wit and of monetary theory. Locke eventually employs his account of wit and judgment in order to use the case of the mixed money to reconceive of monetary policy. So we all know Locke on the difference between wit and judgment, but I will rehearse it. Wit lies most in the assemblage of ideas, putting those together with quickness and variety, wherein can be found any resemblance or congruity, thereby to make up pleasant pictures and agreeable visions in the fancy. Judgment lies quite on the other side, in separating carefully one from another, ideas wherein can be found the least difference, thereby to avoid being misled by similitude and by affinity to take one thing for another. Wit is fantasy and delusion, a surrender to agreeable visions that are impervious to reason. As Locke understood it, wit was a fanciful way of ignoring essential differences between things, whereas judgment employs the ability to carefully distinguish like-seeming things. What few take away from this, what few commentators have taken away from this, however, is that according to Locke, when properly calibrated, the rational function of judgment actually alters empirical perception. When you use judgment, you're actually changing the way you physically perceive the world. Locke applies this account of judgment in his essay Further Considerations Concerning Raising the Value of Money, which has gotten a lot more attention these days by legal scholars and political theorists who consider it an incredibly key text of modernity. Further consideration addresses the problem of debased currency to argue that even debased silver coins contain silver. Debased silver is therefore necessarily of equal value, no matter how much silver has been mixed in. This seems paradoxical, right? A judgment regarding the value of coin would recognize that there is nothing to distinguish debased coin from pure coin, as they share an essential quality. So I'll read you what Locke says about this. It's a very nicely reasoned argument. I answer, one mass of mixed metal, not discerned by the eye to be anything but silver, and therefore called silver, may have a less mixture of baser metal in it than another, and so in common speech is said to be finer silver. So ducatoons having a less mixture of copper in them than our English coin has are said to be finer silver. But the truth is, the silver that is in each is equally fine, as will appear when the baser metal is separate from it. Locke's ultimate point is not that the silver makes the coins essentially the same. It's that the sovereign's assignment of value to silver in general that makes silver coins equally valuable when they have the imprint on them. Money represents a special case in which Locke shows that its value stands up both to the scrutiny of judgment and appeals to the fancy of wit, Locke is cleverly restating Aristotle's theory of monetary nominalism and the underlying conception of nomos. And I'm sorry that I keep going backwards. I know that we're trying to deal with Swift, and I'm going to Locke, and now I go to the case of mixed money, now I'm going to Aristotle. Aristotle held that, quote, money has been introduced by convention as a kind of substitute for a need or demand, and this is why we call it nomisma, because its value is derived not from nature, but from law, and can be altered or abolished at will, end quote. We assign value to money in order for courts to be able to treat unlike things equivalently. This is his argument about corrective justice. I steal your car, I sold your car off. I can't get you your car back, so I've got to pay you the value of the car. It provides the standard by which things can be commensurated to one another by degree or proportion. Nomisma can mean both custom and coin in Greek. And by custom, it can mean tradition or social law. Nomos means law, positive law. So Aristotle's claim here is that the former, coin, payment, and social norms are derived from the latter, law. Norms are derived from external legislation, not the other way around, as many accounts of law assert. Aristotle takes money as the primary example of how law shapes perception and conduct. In one of the key texts of the law and literature movement, Nomos and Narrative, Robert Cover remarks that external legislating, prescription, conjures up normative worlds. Quote, nomos is as much our world as the physical universe of mass, energy, and momentum. Indeed, our apprehension of the structure of the normative world is no less fundamental than our appreciation of the structure of the physical world. Nominalism holds that law ought to direct judgment in order to shape norms and transactions. Otherwise, without the law assigning a given meaning to money, we're just having individual transaction after individual transaction, which is just barter, barter, barter. But all of these individual transactions actually become part of a totality once you have money. So Locke makes this simultaneously a political and epistemological principle. The state must not capitulate to clippers of coin by adjusting the silver content of coins to match the purchasing power of coins. Traffickers in clipped coins could use them for value and still profit off the state by retaining silver and selling it back. Clippers get away with altering the physical content of the coin at the same time as the state does the other half of the work for them by maintaining the illusion of their former value. His preference is not to take in clipped coins and then send out better minted coins, because you're just continuing to reward them and continuing to foster an illusion of the real value around the real value of money. His preference is for the government to devalue currency so that a coin's value is more in line with how it's exchanged. To adjust silver content would be tantamount to interfering with the standards of private exchange and to overlaying a collective fancy over the work of judgment, the judgment of individual transactors. Locke's thesis was that tampering with money constitutes an epistemological crime that unwinds ideas, impairs the ability to make distinctions, and subverts civil government. It's an epistemological crime and a real crime. Swift saw Wood's pre-clipped coins as similarly defrauding the Irish public. He extends Locke's claim that money is the foundation of civil authority to argue that monetary policy had become a colonizing weapon meant to deprive the Irish of lawfulness, of judgment itself, by tampering with the monetary system, so that money suddenly becomes filth trash, right? And here I'm going to conclude on quite a stretch. Samuel Johnson considered Gulliver's gullibility a stylistic weakness. Boswell reports that Johnson dismissed Gulliver's travels when, quote, when once you have thought of big men and little men, it's very easy to do all the rest. What Johnson fails to see, what's impossible for someone like Johnson to be able to see, is that it's precisely in Gulliver's lack of judgment, the inability to properly perceive and distinguish, where the satire lies. The running gag of the travels is Gulliver's inability to perform the realist commensuration that would level each new civilization according to a shared scale. So you're not going to have this problem of giant people and little people if you've got Robinson Crusoe talking about visiting these lands. He's just going to adjust. Without a metric of judgment, Gulliver is unable to evaluate the authority behind each nomos or properly perceive the normative world generated therein. Big ends, little ends, it's all the same to him. Once the fungibility of money is off the table, so goes judgment, perception, and the social contract. Any law, therefore, is as good as any other. Swiftian satire skewers the arbitrary games that tyrants play with common sense and narrative. This is why he is so inaccessible to Johnson, whose erudite obsession with fixed meaning is manifest in dictionaries and critical essays. So, if I were to continue this, I might say that there's a couple of streams of satire. One about incommensurability and where you have a problem sort of landing on the joke, and the other that very clearly indicates where the wit is and is more discreet and less maddening. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, Paul.
I just really wanted to hear Barrett talk about self-disgust in Swift, and also about the sort of racializing of disgust in Gulliver's Travels. So it's just really an invitation more than a specific question.
Yeah, well, that chapter, it's tricky with Yahoos because all the disgusting physical features are right from the handbook of racist tropes for colonial writers at the time, right? But they also represent all of humanity. So I think it's both the kind of particular and the universal being melded together in them.
Also, they have, with their red hair, they
Irish
I always
or,
read them as being Irish too. So I wondered, about Swift and self-disgust.
Oh, and as Anglo-Irish, yeah, as someone. I think he has the, you know, the prejudices of someone born within the pale, right? That for the Irish beyond the pale, and yet I imagine experienced that same kind of prejudice in England, so felt kind of on the outside of both nations or territories. I think that gives his the self-disgust a particularly acute or volatile quality in his writing, because he felt it for the Irish, but felt that same animus directed against himself in England, and felt it halt him in his career, I think, in getting patronage and these sorts of things. I was just saying that I think Swift, Paul had asked about self-disgust and Irishness, and I think that as an Anglo-Irishman, Swift felt or grew up with prejudices against the Irish poor and shared them, but also experienced them directed against himself when he was in England. So the Anglo side of being Anglo-Irish wasn't enough to preserve him for that community. So I think, yeah, I think the self-disgust is kind of at the center of his makeup. Yeah.
Thank you both. I'm going to try to put the two papers together a little bit more and see if I can do it. And I'm thinking, Sharif, about, they were both great, and it's a pleasure to listen to Sharif again. I'm thinking about this Locke and wit and judgment versus wit or / imagination. I'm thinking about that line in the ladies' dressing room where, or the Strephon's fate in the ladies' dressing room when his ideas jump like wits, right? And that's such a great line in the poem, because it's also a moment where he's playing with slang, which he likes to do, and with popular colloquial cliche. But this, basically, he is a victim of a kind of wit that he has to be governed by for the rest of his life. Like, he can't undo that connection between each dame he sees and all her stinks, right? So, and that leads to that witty conclusion of the poem,
Yeah.
right? So that kind of gets me to, I guess, one question I have is that Swift's unique poetics of disgust, that he's forcing us to hold those things in balance and be aware of the error, but still do it, right? That's one question I had. But then I was also thinking, Sharif, about The Beautiful Young Nymph, Going to Bed, that poem that ends with this visceral disgust, right? Who sees shall spew, who smells be poisoned. And before that, we get nothing but compassion, actually, or a lot of compassion for her with the disgust. But I'm thinking for you, Sharif, that that's also a poem about a prostitute, right? Who is a victim of the market economy and is herself almost like human currency. So there are so many connections that I can make, and I'm not sounding particularly coherent here, but I just wonder if you could think a little bit more about your papers in relation to each other, perhaps.
Well, when I think of the ladies' dressing room, so yes, he enjoys the misogyny a lot, but I think that there is also a claim being made there that she is a slave to things, more specifically a slave to commodities bought from abroad, so that you could read the poem as being not only about his false valuation of her, but also about her relationship to the things that she buys. She doesn't quite understand the nature of purchasing power, the violence on which it's founded, which then I think makes it a little more difficult to psychologize Swift, or makes it mean that it means that we have to complicate the psychologizing.
I agree with that. And in terms of, when you talk about his poetics of disgust, or I like the way you went with it toward the gold toilet and the surrealists. I'm curious about the kind of, again, it's the pleasure of the wit of it, of the balance there. That it seems so, again, I'm talking about control, which I seem to be obsessed with in Swift, that there is all that excess, and then there's still control. Like, we've got that triplet of garbage,
Yeah.
you know, not just garbage.
Yeah, I think Swift did. I mean, just on the basis of that poem and the proportion of the disgusting to the beautiful in it, that he enjoyed the disgusting and the provocation it offers. So that's, I guess, why I
Yeah.
headed in that direction. I think it sets up the work as deliberately trying to do something with the disgusting that goes beyond the satiric kind of instrumental use of the disgusting, and that maybe, you know, in one account of the aesthetic, that's where the aesthetic begins, right? It's when things stop being tools and start existing for themselves. So,
No, thank you.
Again, this is an attempt to get the two of you to talk together. At least this is my response to what I heard you talking about together. You were producing, both of you, a very powerful Anglo-Irish satirist with equal parts of emphasis on both. So, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the control that Helen was talking about is precisely what is threatened by the Irish elements of his indignation, given what he understood to be the essentially colonial treatment of things Irish. But there's a deep commitment to retaining the Anglo-Irishness that will somehow live beyond what he takes to be bad policy decisions. And that, for me, is really the play between control and an anger that exceeds the possibility of control, both of which, I think, and I'm following your language here, Helen, both of which coexist in these documents, the poetry or Drapier's letters. So, yes, there is a an element we can psychologize. There is an element we can think of in terms of an aesthetic register, the aesthetic register of control, even as you allow elements of your text to seem to escape that control. But at the back of it all is a really sharp sense of the kinds of essentially colonial issues that mark him as different from just about any other English satirist in that tradition, till we get to Burke, where the same issues and tensions begin to surface with some of the same power.
So I've been trying to figure out for a while who the audience for the Drapier's letters is, because, you know, it's lauded as producing a kind of Irish nationalism, and he is directly addressing shopkeepers and everyday Irish people. But at the same time, the logical appeal is also directed to English, is meant to solicit English outrage at the violation of English rule of law. Which suggests to me that he felt that, on the one hand, there's a contradiction on the one hand where he is telling Irishmen that they are involved in an armed conflict, while at the same time trying to sway the English to the Irish side of the armed conflict. And that's simply never going to convince somebody who isn't Anglo-Irish. So I don't think that there is a real readership for the Drapier's letters, which is why I think Gulliver's Travels had to be written. Because Gulliver's Travels is about our slavish attachment to authoritarian systems, or at least that's one of the features of the satire. So there I think that he had to, while he does make allusions to different nations and political institutions, he is actually there, paradoxically, making an argument about human nature. Even if Gulliver's fallacy is to constantly presume that there's a human nature. So I think I'm still sort of working this out.
I feel Swift is actually making fun of the Drapier when he that the Drapier is dumb to think that you'd have to put money in wheelbarrows and take it around, and the Drapier, that there were Quaker, the Liberties was the center of Quaker activity, Drapiers in Swift's Dublin, and we tend to think of the Drapier speaking as Swift, but I think he's a persona, and Swift is obviously, hated the Woods Halfpence, but not for the reasons he apparently claims. I mean, it was just a colonial boondoggle on England's part, but I don't think his theory of money really goes very far.
I'm sorry that you don't, but I do agree with you that he is mocking the Drapier at certain points. When I give this to legal historians, they get, like I said, they get very frustrated at the bad legal arguments. I think Swift recognizes that bad legal arguments are being made here, but there is this sense that he is losing, that he isn't taking a political stance of his own. He's trying to instrumentalize other people's politics. That's the sense I get when reading it. But I also do think that his reading of monetary theory goes to how he understands scale and measure elsewhere. So I think that's a separate issue. I think that the monetary policy, we don't have to believe that he believes the Drapier's political stances on this monetary issue. But rather, I think that his reading of monetary policy influences his theory of representation, because money is a theory of representation.
Thank you both for your excellent papers.